Okay, Vivien, welcome to the podcast. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Me too. Hi, Alex.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about a few things today, probably. But before we dive into these topics, are you happy to share a little bit of your backstory for our listeners?
Absolutely. It's quite the journey. It's only just kind of, I say over now, but hopefully that's the case. But I always said that I was healthy, like had zero health issues until I was 17. But now knowing what I know, looking back, I can see that there was definitely some issues digestively. I'd get nosebleeds quite frequently, but I never thought that was like a health issue. And it was when I was 17, I wanted to go to the gym. So I was feeling a little bit body conscious as a teenager and thought I'll go to the gym now that I can. And I have a bit of an obsessive personality. So when I get into something, I just do it to the extreme. So that was the case with exercise. So my 1 hour a week exercise turned into 2 hours pretty much every single day. And I did look better. I looked healthier. I was never overweight, but I just didn't feel confident in my body. But when I started to lose weight, I'd get a ton of compliments off people. They were saying how good I looked, and that kind of fueled the fire. But I was actually enjoying it. And because I'd also cleaned up my diet a little bit, my diet was never terrible, but I definitely eating more vegetables. I was eating like low fat, low calorie. So I just wasn't feeling my body enough either. But I was feeling a little bit better because I cut out a ton of the junk food. But that combination of excessive exercise and not enough food led to my period going missing. My skin broke out in terrible acne and my hair started falling out rapidly.
Okay.
And I didn't really care about the period going because like no one at that age really knows the benefits of a healthy menstrual cycle. But it was my mum who was like, this isn't normal. You're going to the doctors at that 3-month mark when it had disappeared. I was more concerned about my hair and my skin as a teenager. So the only suggestion was either the birth control pill or wait and see what happens. Like nothing was mentioned about the exercise. They didn't even ask me what I was eating or not eating. And because I didn't look sick really, apart from the acne, they just said either wait and see what happens, which basically means it's just going to get worse. So the other option was the birth control. So I took the birth control pill. The first one was really not a good fit. It was like a very high strength estrogen pill. And knowing now about my genetics, I have the COMT genetics, which basically means I don't process estrogen well. So it led to depression within like 2 days, like really bad depression. So again, my mum was like, you're not staying on this. I was like, no, it's fine. It'll get better. I'll just push through. But I ended up swapping to a different pill, which did clear up my skin. I had like perfect skin for those 2 years. My hair loss stopped shedding as much, but it literally never grew. I think I had a haircut like twice in 2 years. I never had to shave my legs or anything like that, which was really weird, but I didn't really know that that was a bad sign at the time. But I then started to develop all of these other like weird symptoms like anxiety, food sensitivities at the 2-year mark. And I actually went to America to work at a kids' summer camp as a camp counselor doing aerobics and yoga for the summer when I was 19. And I was still trying to eat healthy when I was there. So it's really difficult to do that because it's pizza, pasta, like all of these things every single day. And I would basically survive on oatmeal, some sweet potato and some chicken and salad every day. And I was working out like 6 hours a day in the intense summer heat. So that was a recipe for my adrenals being a little bit burnt out. I got really bad food poisoning twice towards the end of that trip and potentially contracted Lyme disease during my stay in New York City. After the camp, I was bitten by a mosquito, like head to toe, in like an Airbnb. So it wasn't even in the wilderness where I was previously, it was in New York City. But that's when my health like really took a turn for the worse. When I got home, I was so reactive. My gut would blow up like a balloon after every meal. I actually couldn't keep weight on at that point. So I was trying to, at that point, like I knew that I was not feeling good. So I was trying to like heal my body. I went to see a nutritionist. She was telling me about the potential negative effects of the pill on my gut health and how it was really masking everything. And by that time, I really wanted to be healthy. I wanted to eat more foods and healthy foods and not exercise as much, but I was just losing a ton of weight. And my digestion was terrible. I came off the pill, my skin got worse again. And then over the years, so from 19 till probably 24 or 5, I'm 26 now for reference. It's only been in the past year or so. I spent that whole time finding something that works, feeling good for a while, and then my symptoms would just come back. And I was really just managing my symptoms. I got to a point where I could maintain pretty clear skin and pretty regular menstrual cycles, but only if I was spending like £300 a month on supplements. I was doing weekly coffee enemas. I was eating a strict, organic, low histamine diet, because I noticed that I was reacting to high histamine foods, which are some of the healthiest foods out there. I was reading like How to Heal the Gut, fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha every meal. My skin was so inflamed and so angry, but I was like, I'm just detoxing, I'll just push through, not realizing that I was like really making my body more inflamed. So I found the histamine piece, I thought I'd found the answer, and then I realized that it wasn't normal to have to eat such a restrictive diet and spend all of this money and have all of this support to be healthy. So it wasn't until the end of last year, I was seeing more and more online about mold illness and mycotoxin exposure. And up until that point, I'd never heard of it before. I knew what mold was, obviously, but I didn't know how it can affect our health negatively and our immune system. And it can lead to things like mast cell activation, which I really believe that I developed that because of mold. So I was seeing it everywhere. I think it really was the universe sending me all of these messages. And then I got a leaflet through the post for the Great Plains Lab, the company in the US. They were holding a seminar in London. This random leaflet came through the door, and it was called Mold and Mast Cells. So I knew that mast cells were an issue for me because of the histamine and allergy type reactions I was getting. So I went to the seminar at the end of last year. They gave us a complimentary urine mycotoxin test just for attending. I did the test when I got home, and it lit up like a Christmas tree, like through the roof to like high on pretty much every mycotoxin. Wow. So I was planning on moving anyway. I was due to move this year, but it got delayed because of COVID, and the renovations and everything took a little bit longer than expected. But I'd lived in that house, so it was my family home. I'd lived there since I was like 4 years old. And I think it's always had an issue with mold because it was a Victorian, like 1890s house in the northwest of England. So obviously there's going to be some mold issues. But I remember around the time that all of these health issues started for me, my dad developed health issues. My mum developed autoimmune thyroid. So my dad developed hives, urticaria, randomly, and like allergies to seafood and peppers, which nobody like put the puzzle pieces together. And I think with mold, because it is the great mimicker, there could be a household of people. One person could have one issue, the other person could have another, and no one's looking at the commonalities between the two. So I moved back in June of 2020 and has been through like a major detox protocol, just trying to get my health back on track. So we're at the 6-month mark now of me moving, and I really feel like the healthiest I've ever felt. It's been a rough like learning curve with everything that I've been through, but it's crazy because I never learned anything about mold when I was studying or at college. And now that I know, I'm seeing it literally everywhere. When there's like certain clients, and I can immediately tell that mold's an issue. I try to not jump in there right away because it could just be as simple as a lack of vegetables or not enough sleep. But I think it's quite a big problem, and not a lot of people are talking about it.
Yeah, it's something that, and the same as you, probably the last year or two have become really interested in molds. And I think you're right. It's definitely, when we're on the topic of individuals, certainly with chronic health issues, it's one of those big rocks that we need to be exploring with our questioning and potentially with testing if there's stuff there. But it's really challenging, I think, as well, isn't it? Because it's so hard to know whether there's been mold exposure. I always think back to one client who I worked with years ago for IBS. We got some improvement in her health. We stopped working together. And then I got this random call from her like 3 years later. she had started to develop chronic fatigue sort of symptoms, and she was redoing the kitchen. She pulled down the wallpaper, and then suddenly that's when she becomes aware that there's a whole bunch of mold in the kitchen. So it's a really complex and challenging area to kind of navigate, isn't it?
Yeah, I would never jump straight into it with a client or freak them out immediately, because it could just be something really basic, but it's always now in the back of my mind as being a potential problem, especially in the UK, because we're on a floating island in the middle of the sea, basically. And especially in the US, I have a lot of clients in the US, and I think they're more aware of it there because of the natural disasters and the hurricanes. And in Florida, like, a lot of people know that it's moldy in those humid places. But in the UK, it's just not really spoken about at all. And it's, even with these newer buildings, so the house that I was in currently, even if my family had never experienced a water event or flood or anything like that, you can think of how many people have lived there previously and maybe haven't dealt with something correctly. But we had a crawl space under our house, so there was zero visible mold in that home. So when I bring it up to clients, they think I'm calling them dirty or that they aren't like sanitary and things like that, that they have mold in the house. A lot of the times it's not visible. And that's the thing, that's the scary part of mold. And we had this crawl space under the house, and I think around the time that everyone in the family's health issues started, it did flood one summer, and I think a pipe burst, and my dad tried to remediate it on his own, just like getting the water out, but it was never dealt with properly. So I think that's where the issue started. But signs that you could have some mold issues, if there is a musty smell. But when you're in that environment currently, mold is sneaky as well because it suppresses your sense of smell, so then you can't detect it. So what would happen with me is that I'd go on holiday, or when I went to London for that seminar, when I came back after 4 days, I could really smell the mustiness for about 30 minutes, and then I couldn't smell it anymore. It's like when you get used to, like people who are bin men and things, they just get used to that and they can't really smell it anymore. So if there's any mustiness, that is pretty much mold all the time. I know people say it's just mildew. Mildew is mold. And anything like the wallpaper is wet or bubbling a little bit, the seals on the window have gone, they've blown out, could be like damp carpets, or just being in an old home and you've had a known water event. If it's not been fully dealt with, there could be some issues there.
Yeah, and I guess are there kind of common sites within the home that we might want to be extra mindful of as a result of that?
Yeah, people mainly are familiar with around the windowsills, but a lot of the time when I talk about mold exposure, that's not the type that gets you really sick. Just that little bit of black fuzzy stuff in the corner isn't really the issue. The main places would be the kitchen. So I make an effort now, just because I don't want this to happen again to me, is like every week on a Sunday, I look under the sinks in my kitchen, in my bathroom, and just touch everything, make sure that nothing's wet, and make sure a pipe hasn't burst or anything. So kitchens, bathrooms, and the like utility rooms where the washing machine, dryers are, those are the most common places. And basements are pretty bad, especially if they're like old basements and they haven't been kind of built properly or insulated. Crawl spaces, attics and lofts, they would be the most common places, I think.
Okay. And I guess within all of this, sort of ventilation is a really important part of kind of the building.
Yeah, and with newer, like people think, oh, a newer build is fine, I'm good, because my house was only 5 years old, but it's a lot of the newer builds that are being made now they're really effective at keeping the air tight and warm and heated in the winter, but that's really affecting the circulation of the airflow, and that's what makes them also just as risky as like a very old building. So they're doing a really good job at keeping us warm, but that circulation isn't happening. And the humidity is also important. So in the summer that we had a few months back, it was quite hot. And if the humidity gets too high, that is also another risk factor. So I think keeping the humidity less than 50% is what's recommended. You can get little testing meters to check that out, or dehumidifiers.
Nice. Yeah. I always joke with Katie because we have a Victorian home and you can literally feel the draft. So sometimes I'm like, that's great. That's what we want.
I know, exactly. Yeah, and keeping your windows open as much as possible, obviously when it's not pouring down with rain. If you live nearby to water or like the ocean or anything like that, that could be potentially another risk factor, but there's tons of things that you can do. And just having your eyes open and peeled for potential issues is the best way. You don't have to like scour your home and freak out that there's an issue. I just knew intuitively that my current home just hasn't, I've become like a bloodhound with smelling out mold. I can smell it from a mile away now. So I feel pretty safe that my new home is fine, but there are tests available to check that out.
Perfect. So we've kind of discussed common areas of the home that we might want to be particularly mindful of. From a body perspective, are there any kind of, I understand that, you know, molds can contribute to a huge list of things, but are there kind of some more kind of go-to signs or symptoms that mold might be involved?
So mold can affect every system and symptom in some way, as you said. With mold illness, there's a condition that you can develop called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. And if someone has symptoms in one or more body systems, so like the brain, the neurological and the digestive system, or the urinary tract and the liver, there's like multiple different systems combined, then that is a sign that mold could be a driving factor. But from the head down, hair loss can be a big one. If you're dealing with chronic hair loss and you've ruled out a thyroid issue, iron issue, acute stress, postpartum, all of that stuff, but it's still ongoing, mold can be a driver of that. And I used to think that it was just whilst you're in the mold that hair loss can happen. That's what I learned about. But I'm actually currently going through a lot of hair loss post mold exposure. So like the detox that I went through was a lot on my body as I was releasing the toxins. I've lost, I think, 10 kilograms of inflammation weight in 6 months without changing my diet. I'm doing less exercise than I've ever done, but your body fats can actually store mycotoxins and heavy metals and things. So when I lost all of that weight, my body was stressed out by the toxin circulation and my hair loss was affected as a result. But hair growth issues, you can have brain fog. I got to the point early this year when I was still in my other home because of the lockdowns in March. So from March to June when I moved, those few months, I felt like I had dementia, and I'm 26 for reference, because I was at home all the time. I wasn't going to the gym anymore. I work from home, I work online. So I wasn't leaving the house at all because we couldn't. And spending all of that time there, I just felt like my brain wasn't functioning. I couldn't string a sentence together. I would have to write down every single thing that I would want to say to a client, just so I wouldn't forget anything. And I remember when I moved, a few days into me living in my new home, I remember ringing someone. Usually I'd have to make a script. And I remember just having a conversation and being able to speak. And I was like, whoa, this is different. Like, I've not had this in a while. So anything cognitive, brain fog, even things like dementia, Alzheimer's have been linked to chronic mold exposure, along with some other environmental toxicity. You can have issues with thyroid, the resistant weight loss, so you can't lose weight or you can't gain weight, so either extreme. Some people, they're eating thousands of calories every single day, but they still can't put on weight. Most people are the opposite, so they are holding an extra 10, 20 pounds of body fat and they can't lose it. You can have a lot of cardiovascular type things, so palpitations, atrial fibrillation, digestive, IBS, inflammatory bowel disease can be linked to mycotoxin exposure as well. A lot of bladder things like interstitial cystitis. Mine was linked to the histamine reactions when I would eat some of those foods. They are well-known IC triggers for a lot of people, but I think it's because of the mycotoxins. They really inflame the mucous membranes of the body. So the gut lining, the bladder lining, sometimes the mouth can be affected as well. Reproductively, I really believe that I got diagnosed with PCOS with my acne and the hair loss and everything. I really think that mold exposure was the cause of my PCOS. And that's in none of the textbooks or webinars that I watched. But mold can make you more insulin resistant. It can make you more inflamed. It can mess with your adrenals. Those three things are the drivers of PCOS in the first place. And mold really inflames the brain. So in the last few months of living there, I'd stopped ovulating. And ovulation is a sign of health. I don't want to get pregnant anytime soon, but I want to ovulate because that's how I would manage my PCOS and have a healthy menstrual cycle and fertility. It's a sign of health. Because my body was so stressed, and so it felt like something was wrong in the environment. Even though when we talk about stress, people think mental and emotional, worrying, stress can be physical as well. So I had a physical infection, and it was inflaming my brain, and my brain had shut down the fertility centers so that I wasn't able to get pregnant even if I wanted to. And I tried everything else to manage my PCOS and got to the point where I could manage it, but I actually just recently started ovulating again, and my PCOS symptoms have gone into remission as a result. So anything hormonal can be linked. There's a few mycotoxins or mold toxins that are, they have estrogenic-like effects. So it can mimic things like endometriosis, fibroids, any abnormal growths in the body can be linked, and skin issues as well. So skin issues that are chronic. I was eating like the healthiest diet ever. I was doing, quote, all the right things, but I still had really bad acne as a result of mold. It can be eczema, psoriasis, rashes, hives are a big one as well. So I could go on, but that's a big list of common symptoms. And fatigue, that's like a huge one as well.
Yeah. So I am, one thing I want to ask around that is, I know that Dr. Neil Nathan talks about ice pick stabbing pains as a common one, but I must admit, I don't think I've ever yet found that. Is that something, is that a trend that you've seen?
Yeah, I had that. I used to get it as a child. And as I said before, I've lived in that house pretty much all my life, and I never thought I had issues. But me and my brother's 4 years older than me, we used to get this pain in our head, and we used to call it lava because it felt like a cracking sensation and then like rushing blood, hot, fiery, like acid in the brain. And I forgot about that for a long time until I read some of the symptoms include ice pick pain. So I used to get it in my head like once a week at least. And during my detox a few months back, I actually got that again because it flared up. Some people don't get it in the head. So some people it's like in the thigh or somewhere else in the body, in the chest. But it just feels like exactly that. When you have it, you'll know exactly what it is, but it's hard to imagine when you've never experienced it before. But yeah.
And are there any things that can often get sort of associated with mold? So something that I sort of read, I guess more in like blogs and anecdotal evidence, this idea that once you have mold, you're more likely to have heavy metal accumulation or parasites, etc. So what's your experience with the connection between these things?
Yeah, so I think with Lyme disease, that's a big one. And I have tested positive for Borrelia last year as well. But a lot of people just focus on the Lyme disease. They just kill, like get rid of the bacteria. And it's pretty hard to do that anyway. And that's why a lot of the failure rates are so high. I really think, and I know a lot of practitioners who agree with this, that mold is actually a huge problem. There's a Dave Asprey podcast, and I think the title of it is, it's not mold, it's not Lyme, it's mold. That's the title of the episode. Because with mold exposure, it really suppresses your immune system. And therefore, these bacteria and viruses that we're all exposed to, like most people have Epstein-Barr virus, tons of people have exposures to ticks and co-infections. Why is it the one person is totally fine, yet the other person is chronically sick and bedbound as a result? So I've not really focused in on the Lyme disease treatment. I'm going to test early next year just to see how things are. But I really feel like now that my immune system's strong again, even if I did have the Borrelia, it's being kept in check by my immune system. That's how it should be. But there's also a big connection with parasites. Parasites are like the larger organisms, and they can harbor or hold other infections. So within parasites lay viruses, heavy metals, and mycotoxins. So in order to fully detox from heavy metals like mercury, mycotoxins and mold illness or viruses like EBV, you actually need to knock out the parasites first to get to those smaller organisms. So that's been another thing that I've been doing over the past few months is parasite cleansing, and I've noticed the biggest difference from that as well.
Okay.
I've done multiple different things. It's hard to say like what's the one most effective tool that I've added, but I think parasite cleansing is huge. And I've done parasite cleanses in the past, but I think the order of operations is really important too, because if I was still living in the moldy house, I would never be able to get rid of infections because my immune system was just so weak. So the thing with mold is, number one, you need to get out, or you need to remediate the problem. Otherwise, all of your other efforts aren't really going to make a big difference.
Yeah. Okay. And when you talk about parasites, are you talking about sort of GI parasites or also sort of more systemic?
Yeah, they can be systemic, and I've done stool testing. My recent stool test came back clear, and it has done for years from parasites. I've had the blasto and Dientamoeba come back previously, and I've used the GI map multiple times. So that is a really good stool test, but it's checking for like 7 or 8 out of potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of parasites. So even if your stool test comes back clear, it doesn't mean that you're completely free of parasites. And I did a stool test on a Monday a few months back. It came back negative. On Wednesday, I literally passed parasites into the toilet and I could see them. So if that's not evidence, I don't know what is.
Huh, that's interesting. So I guess that is essentially just passing of a parasite that wasn't tested for ultimately.
Yeah, and the types of parasites, the ones on the stool test, like the Dientamoeba, Blastocystis, they're the most recognized ones. Like some doctors even recognize those, but there are other ones like liver flukes that don't really get tested. I think there's one like nematodes. They're called rope worms.
Yeah.
It's a bit debated whether they're actually real worms or not, and it's usually what people pass on some of these parasite cleanses. So they look like long, white, stringy worms, but it could be just a combination of mucoid plaque, so buildup of mucus and undigested food and biofilm that's actually coming out, not an actual parasite. But I've heard stories of people doing parasite cleanses and blowing their nose, and there being little worms in there as well. So they can live in the brain, in the muscles, and even one of the Lyme co-infections, Babesia, that is, I think it's a red blood cell parasite as well. So when most people talk about parasites, they're talking about the GI ones, but they can live elsewhere in the body.
Interesting. Okay. And that's really great to know around things like the mucoid plaque and undigested food or biofilm, because I do have clients sometimes who like to send me photos of their bowel.
I made an effort not to check my emails whilst eating.
I'm totally cool with that. But sometimes, you know, there is sort of a conviction that it's something like a worm or a parasite. But some of them looking back, I'm like, maybe that is more kind of a biofilm or a mucoid plaque thing. I think.
And within that, because some of them are microscopic, obviously, they're probably parasites within that, but the ropey looking things, they're usually not actual parasites.
Sure. Okay. Brilliant. So with all that in mind, I mean, you touched a little bit on, let's say, treatment considerations. So from a high level perspective, what are some things that, you know, you as a practitioner, we're not necessarily obviously recommending people go away and do this on their own, but are there some sort of big key themes that you would be thinking about, and how would you potentially go about, I guess, kind of structuring this? You mentioned, obviously, if you were in your old home, it wouldn't be a good idea necessarily to do a parasite cleanse, for example.
So is this for mold specifically, or just?
Feel free to kind of maybe come up with any scenario just to give context. So it doesn't have to be mold, but I guess continuing this conversation, maybe someone who's got mold and even suspected heavy metals or parasites.
And the thing is, once you have one, you've probably got multiple different infections anyway. They're known as the frenemies, so they often go together hand in hand. So if someone is living in mold or they've tested positive for mycotoxins, the best step, if you can, I know it's like a life-changing thing, you can't just up and leave your house or spend tens of thousands of pounds sometimes on remediation. But if you can get out of the environment or deal with that as quickly as possible, that's going to make the biggest change to your health. Because if you're breathing in toxic air, we overlook this so much. I know you're big on like ancestral living and getting back to the basics. Like we're so focused on micronutrient levels and all of this like surface level stuff, which is important. But if you're eating toxic food, breathing toxic air, and you're majorly stressed out because of trauma, those are like really basic things that get overlooked these days. So step 1 to 3 is probably get out of the mold, avoid. And then I would just let your body, I made this mistake, I was pushing it a little bit too hard because I'd like worked up to learning about all this stuff and gotten ready to move. And I was like, I'm just going to go for it. I told you I have a bit of an obsessive personality. I had 2 weeks off work and I just wanted to spend my full day detoxing, but I made a mistake because I pushed it too hard. I like passed out and hit my head on the floor at one point. So please don't make that mistake. Your body will naturally start detoxing on its own anyway. So it could be that you have a month just out of the environment, breathing clean air again. Your body will naturally start to reduce inflammation and get those toxins circulating without any additional support. But it would also, if you're someone like me who has a lot of inflammation and histamine allergy type reactions, because it can lead to mast cell activation or high histamine levels, I would potentially go in with some anti-inflammatory support like quercetin or holy basil, which is an adaptogen, just to calm the immune system down, that overreactivity. And then it's very important to go low and slow with mold exposure. I don't know if you are familiar with Beth O'Hara. She's quite big into the mold exposure and mast cell activation syndrome. She has a good quote: going fast is going to be slow, but going slow is going to be fast. So really it's a marathon, not a sprint when it comes to mold, because you can really make yourself sick. So I would start with some gentle lifestyle-based things or like additional tools. A big one for me was coffee enemas. They were a lifesaver for me, really made a huge difference, and they're one of the least expensive supplements out there, but really well tolerated by a lot of people. So coffee enemas are great. I bought an infrared sauna mat from Get Fit. I think you, yeah, with Mark. You've spoken to him before, I think. His infrared saunas are really great. So that helped just not heat my body too much, because I was really sensitive at that point to too much heat and sweating. So that one is like a lower temperature, but it really, I would wipe the little bit of sweat off that I did have, and there would literally be black marks on the towel afterwards because my body was like pushing it out through the skin. Epsom salt baths are really good. Some people get a detox reaction from that if they're really sensitive. So even a foot bath is good. Hydration, herbal teas, so tulsi tea or holy basil as a tea form. Another one is powder arco tea. That's very antifungal. So it's just a good way to get some medicinal benefits into your system without pushing it too hard. And then once you're feeling a little bit more stable, you can then start to play around with binders and antifungals. And I started off with just the regular binders, like Toxaprevent is a common one, activated charcoal, and they were quite constipating, and I did get some detox reactions from them, so you really need to be careful and start slowly. But then I came across, I don't know if you're familiar with the Cellcore Biosciences line. Yeah, I really love their stuff. So they specialize in chronic illness, mold, Lyme, and it's a group of naturopathic doctors in the US who had found that they had to come up with different protocols because their clients just weren't tolerating the generally recommended things. So they have a binder called Biotoxin Binder, and it's amazing. So you can take that with or without food, because before I'd have to schedule my day around my binders and my supplements because they couldn't be taken with certain things. You'd have to time them away from food. So it was just so much effort. With these ones, you can take them any time of day. And the whole supplement line is based around carbon technology. So they have hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen-based products. And that is like the way that our body is built. Our body is built off fundamentally those things. Whereas as well, we're very focused on like the micronutrients and those things when we should be looking at the big building blocks for our body. So that binder is very well tolerated, very effective. They've even done case studies that they've shown on their website before. There's people still living in mold who add the product in, and the mycotoxin levels reduce on a test. So if there is someone listening who can't get out of the environment, it's the same with my parents, because my parents are still living in that other home, and I'm like so anxious for them all the time with what I know. They've tried to remediate, but they've just not done a good job. So I think they've actually made it worse. So I've just got them ongoing now on binders, just for peace of mind for me, just to know that they're doing something at least to help. And then I think that's when I added in the parasite stuff as well. And again, that company, I'm not sponsored or anything by them, but I just really love their stuff. And I've done parasite cleanses in the past, but within a few days of adding in this one herb or product that I've never heard of before, it's called Mimosa Pudica seed. And it's like an Ayurvedic parasite cleanser. It basically suffocates the parasites and kind of drags them out through the body. It's like a fibrous gel when you have it. And then I did the parasite cleansing for around 3 months, really upping the dosage of these things around the full moon as well, because that's where the parasites are more active. And the last round that I did last month, or it was Halloween actually. So the last full moon that I did the cleanse on was on Halloween. It was the full moon. I was on my period, and October was known as in Chinese medicine, the month of the large intestine. So it's like a really powerful time I did the full moon cleanse on. And I felt so much detox symptoms. My joints were killing. And I used to get joint pain quite a lot because, a bit of a side tangent, but mold can lead to joint hypermobility as well. So I didn't have Ehlers-Danlos or anything like that, but I did get joint hypermobility a few years back because of mold exposure. And my joints, my knees were killing in the night. I felt like I was getting sick. I would get a scratchy throat. My nose was congested. I'd get fatigue and headaches as a die-off reaction. So that's when the parasite stuff would come in kind of my approach. And then the very last things to address, in my opinion, would be the heavy metals and things like Lyme disease and co-infections. Once you've got the gut working, once your immune system's stronger, 80 to 90% of that is going to be addressed anyway. Because if you're backed up and constipated, you're not going to be able to detox heavy metals anyway. And going in with like a strong, harsh detox IV therapy, chelation or anything like that is going to make you way sicker. It's all about like prepping the body, opening up the drainage and the detox pathways first, getting your immune system at least strong enough to deal with a little bit of die-off, because it's not going to be a smooth sailing linear path. It's going to be, you're going to have some rough times sometimes. But the order of operations is really important. The liver can be really congested and burdened from mold exposure as well. Your glutathione levels and antioxidant levels can be really suppressed. And mold is like really sneaky with how it works, because it can shut down your own antioxidant production and your own immune system so that it can survive. So it's just a vicious cycle. And that's why it's the great mimicker, because not having enough glutathione, you're going to be chronically inflamed, and chronic inflammation is the root cause to all disease.
So do you use supplemental kind of glutathione a lot? Or?
I did start with that because that's like one of the biggest things that I read about in the book Toxic and some other resources, but it's very powerful, and I actually had a very bad reaction to it. And I know with some of the mycotoxin tests, they tell you to provoke the mold first with a challenge. I got the worst migraine ever after having glutathione, and my acne got really bad. So it was the right thing. I needed glutathione, but the best way for me to get glutathione is to remove the mold so that my natural body can make glutathione on its own. Or I could potentially go in with something like a glycine supplement that was quite effective so that my body has the glycine to build glutathione. But just pushing, it's like when you have a clogged drain, if you just push more and more into it, it might be a good thing to get that drain going, but it's just too much, especially for sensitive people like me. So you can supplement with glutathione. I prefer the liposomal ones, but some people need to start with just like a drop of it because it's that strong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always important, I think, to appreciate all of these things, or we're all on a spectrum ultimately in regards to the severity, the load of that toxin we have and how sensitive we are. And I think sometimes it can be really frustrating when we hear people who, let's say responded really well to liposomal glutathione, we try it and actually we get worse, and it can be really disheartening, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to like read blogs and just implement. I told my clients not to do this, but I did this as well because I was just so desperate. I knew that I'd found the missing puzzle piece for me, so I was really excited, but I just tried to do things too quickly. With mold, I said I'd lived there like pretty much all my life. I don't think just the mold was the problem. It was the fact that I'd been on the birth control pill, stressed my body with too much exercise. I went to the trip to America. I got food poisoning. So it was the straw that broke the camel's back to return home, potentially contracted Lyme disease, and then the mold exposure just knocked me on my bum, basically. So it's never just one thing. And I always ask my clients, when was the last time you felt well, or what was the turning point? What was the trigger? And most people just think it was my divorce, it was that car crash I was in, it was that trip to Bali. But maybe they've forgotten about the trauma when they were 10 years old, or the bullying that they went through, or the 20 courses of antibiotics that they were on when they were a child. All of that is still important, but then there might be that triggering event. So in order to heal, you do need to address the mold, because that is a big factor, but you still need to go through all of that other stuff. But I'd done all of that other stuff first. I did it in like a backwards order. I'd healed my gut, tried to like 50 times. I'd restored my thyroid and come off the pill and dealt with the stress management, but I was still not 100%. So that's when the mold took me to dealing with the mold took me to the next level.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I think we all have a mentality which is kind of, there's this one thing or maybe two things which if we can just resolve, we'll be fine. But what you said there is just so right in regards to, I think the way I sort of describe it now is both health and dis-ease. It's just accumulative, ultimately. Our entire life story is having an influence on how we currently feel and how susceptible we are to all of these different environmental exposures. And the work of, I always reference Dr. Or Gabor Mate's book, When the Body Says No, because he talks about some of these individuals who might have a higher mercury load, for example, but actually don't have the symptoms and cognitively, physiologically are functioning very well, to someone who's got a less or a lower load, but actually is expressing a lot of the symptoms or conditions that we associate with a heavy metal toxicity, which is really interesting. Which takes me to the thought, are you familiar with Dr. Campbell and the test that he brought out looking at IgG and IgE?
Yeah. I've not done that personally, but I wasn't sure, because when I think about IgG, IgE, I think of allergies, and I don't have an allergy to mold. I think everyone is sensitive to mycotoxins to a certain level, but I have the genetic mutation. I think it's 25% of the population have the HLA gene. Kind of goes along with the autoimmune type gene. My mum's side of the family has Hashimoto's, my dad's side has psoriasis. So I choose to be gluten-free just because I know that there's such a strong correlation between gluten and autoimmune. But with the genetic side of things, I think everyone has the ability to get sick from mold when it's been extreme levels and it's like a really bad black mold Stachybotrys case. But for me, my immune system doesn't recognize mold as being a threat. So when the average person breathes in mold, their immune system recognizes it and it gets it out of the body immediately. When my body breathes in mold, it's just allowed to stay in, proliferate and cause problems and suppress my immune system. So a lot of the time, women are the ones in the household who get the sickest. So I was like the canary in the coal mine for my other family members. I was the one with obvious symptoms, whereas they were also dealing with health issues, but not to the extreme that I was. And I think women get more affected because they have slightly higher levels of body fat. Even if you're not overweight, women just have naturally high levels of body fat. So we store and accumulate mycotoxins easier. And if men have a higher blood volume, so that kind of dilutes some of the toxicity within the body as well. So women often get called hypochondriacs, or it's just in your head that you have these health issues. And it could also be affecting the husband or the male in the house, but maybe his symptoms don't come out until he's 80 years old and then develops Parkinson's type symptoms. So I feel kind of blessed to have this like awareness now of mold. It is a negative in some ways because I have to limit my time in my parents' house now and just be conscious of that. Or if I go to a hotel, I need to make sure that it's not like a really old hotel. But yeah, I think it's good to be the canary in the coal mine, because things like environmental toxins affect everyone, and I'm sensitive to chemicals and cleaning products now, and I've just had to clean up my whole entire life because of this, but that will benefit me in the long run with my fertility, my disease risk down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. On that point, are you happy, if you're able to, kind of off the top of your head, are there any kind of companies or resources that you direct people to when we're talking about kind of properties and getting them assessed or getting them remediated, or people that kind of are in this area, as it were?
Yeah, in the UK, it's I've had to like research this. Just I'm not like a building expert or anything like that. I think there's a lot more options in the US, unfortunately, just because it's more of a problem, more recognised, and a bigger country. In the UK, you can access some of the home tests through the US. So if it's just like the Petri dish, if you just want to overview like if there's mold, how bad it is, it's not the most comprehensive, but it could be a good starting point. The companies Mycometrics and Immunolytics in the US offer the mold plates. It depends on how many rooms you've got, if you have pets, carpets, wood floors, as to which company is probably the best. So I would look into those, and you can just ship them through the post to the US companies. But the gold standard, and if you're gonna investigate and you're not really sure, maybe the mold tests have come back negative, that isn't a complete no. There could still be an issue there. So the building forensics company in the UK is the only one that I really know about, but I think it's just like one company, and they travel up and down the UK, so it's probably a lot of money. But if you're going to do it, they do like the proper testing. They have I think they use like UV lights, and they really go in there with the masks and everything. So if you get someone in who's not masked up or is like just saying that mold really isn't a problem, then that's a really bad sign. They should be protecting themselves. That shows that they know the negative effects of mold. But in terms of remediation, they don't then do the remediation as well. They just give you the protocol to give to a building team to follow to the T. So that's going to be a lot of money. Yeah. So in some cases, it's probably easier to move house than do all of that work, but it just depends on the individual case.
No, absolutely. And that's the hard part ultimately, isn't it? It's when especially if you own that property. Fortunately, I think the majority of people I've worked with have always been in rented properties, and then there's an easier way out. I even had one client who just had a tent in the garden.
Yeah. Got to do what you can.
Yeah. And he just knew, it was so obvious to him that when he went in that home, that his symptoms just so flared up. It was like he just camped until his tenancy ran out.
So sometimes it's in the workplace as well. So if someone's listening and resonates with those symptoms that I mentioned, but they've had home testing, or they're just really certain that it's not their home, it might be their workplace. So maybe not this year, but if in 2020 you've noticed a significant benefit to your health and you've not been at the office as much, then that could be a link. Or do you have co-workers who also have sinusy issues or chronic fatigue? They're always complaining that they're tired. Is it an old building? That could be another sign that mold is a problem, but not in your home.
Yeah. And it's funny, the penny dropped for me not even that long ago, probably, the idea of, when we ask our clients, do you feel better when you go away on holiday? Oh, stress is probably something to think about. It's like, well, maybe, but there's probably some other things here, including mold, that we start thinking about.
Yeah, and I noticed that as well when I go on holiday, even if it was just to Cornwall for the summer, I could eat a ton more foods. I wouldn't get the histamine reactions and acne and breakouts. My brain would feel better, my gut wouldn't be as sensitive, and then when I get home, everything would just come back right away. So that was an obvious sign. So yes, stress levels are a part of that, but it could also be your home environment, not just mold either, but your water quality, your heavy metals, off-gassing from furniture and chemicals in the house. There's so much to think of.
Yeah. And I think I'm right in saying, from memory, I've read a couple of papers that talk about, not just mold, but there's kind of toxic soup of other stuff that is often present as well, whether that's bacteria, LPS from bacteria. So there's a lot of other things that we can be inhaling or getting exposed to when there is kind of water and dampness there.
Yeah, and Wi-Fi and 5G amplify that like a million times. I think it's like 60 times or something more mycotoxins being produced when it's next to the Wi-Fi box or the Wi-Fi router. And I did an experiment in my old house. I tracked my sleep with an Oura ring. And for the last few months of living there, I started to turn the Wi-Fi off at night because I'm not using it, so I might as well just give it a try. My deep sleep massively improved. I was dreaming again. I just wasn't dreaming for years. And my recovery, my HRV was a lot higher. So that's a habit that I've stuck with. And they've done studies. I think it was Dr. Klinghardt. He did the Petri dish study where he put a Petri dish of mold next to the Wi-Fi and it just explodes with toxin production. But things like endotoxin, LPS, mycotoxins, mycoplasma, they all go together. But mold is the strongest. And if you ever looked at like a slice of bread and you see the mold and it's got like that white ring outside of it, it's trying to claim the area. So it can do that in your house as well. So that's why it's so toxic.
Yeah, because the mycotoxins, correct me if I'm wrong, are kind of like, as you said, they're the defense mechanisms of the molds. So,
and when you anger it, when you go in and knock a wall down without protecting yourself, it can make it even worse. And it can, if there was mold that was suppressed or like hidden behind a wall and not too bad, and then you knock it down, that can just explode the mold and the mycotoxins and spread them further into the home.
Yeah. And Dr. Nathan's actually talked about having done some sort of repeat testing with clients that binders can do that. So sometimes actually, if you overdose the binders, you'll actually sometimes see higher levels of mycotoxins in the urine. And again, is that the mold kind of fighting back from you trying to get rid of it?
Yeah, and it can be, I've had that happen with the clients as well. We started on a gut protocol. We didn't know it was mold at the time, but then we tested the mycotoxins, and because we'd been doing like antifungals and caprylic acid and Saccharomyces boulardii and NAC, some of those can be used for mold. And her gliotoxin, which is one of the mycotoxins, was like 3,000, which is like extremely high. And I think it's not because we angered it. I think it's because it was started to be mobilized. So when you're doing a urine test, you're seeing what your body is detoxing. There's some people who are chronically sick and suppressed and aren't mobilizing the mycotoxins at all, that the urine test comes back negative every single time, but they're still full of mycotoxins and mold. So I would actually see the numbers getting higher as a sign that you're now getting them out the body. Whereas it can get a little bit worse before it gets better. So it should flare up a little bit, showing that your body is now excreting it at a higher rate. And then over time, I'm yet to do my retest. I'm going to do that in January to see over the past 6 months how things have changed. But if you test too early, you can often see that spike before it starts to just lower and lower.
Yeah, brilliant. All right. Is there anything within this sort of topic that we are yet to mention?
I think just the connection with hormones, and we were saying before we hit record that I spent so long just trying to lower my estrogen level and boost my progesterone and like use topical things for my acne. And they all served a purpose and they all helped, but I was missing, like even as a practitioner, I was missing the root of the problem. I knew that my gut was important, but why was my gut dysfunctional in the first place? Why did I constantly have SIBO and bacterial overgrowth happening? Why did I constantly have to heal my gut and take probiotics every day? So looking deeper under that, I found that mold was an issue. For me, it's not a problem for everyone, so I don't want to make that claim. But always like be that annoying kid who's asking why until you get back right to the start. But there isn't ever just one root cause. I always talk about like the root cause of a problem, but there's always multiple causative factors and that accumulation, that triggering event. So looking at it all and seeing your hormone imbalances, whether that is PMS, painful periods, infertility, lack of ovulation, skin issues, hair loss, they're all symptoms. So rather than just looking, they're like the tip of the iceberg, rather than just looking at the symptom, look underneath the surface to all of these things. And I found that the root of a lot of chronic illness is stress and trauma, chronic infections, with things like parasites, and then environmental toxicity, heavy metals, mold, mycotoxins, and things like glyphosate. That's what I've seen. But there are just the people who have acne, they just need to cut out dairy from their diet and they're good. But I'm talking about the people who are like chronically sick and chronically struggling.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important message, because it's very easy to, I guess, overcomplicate our health. There might be a simple solution that we just aren't aware of, or that we're not thinking of. And I sometimes wonder, and this is me sort of reflecting on my own journey, is if there's something that you don't want to change, I think we're very good at casting what's the expression? Essentially looking the other way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's sometimes we've got to be honest with ourselves that actually, is this having a role to play within why we feel the way we feel?
Yeah, and some people are like really resistant when I mention mold. They're like, no, not me. Like, it's too difficult. Let's just ignore it. But then there's some people like me, when I was seeing it, I knew intuitively that it was the problem, but it's just a lot of stress. And when it's your home, it's an extra like layer on top of it, and like your belongings. And sometimes you have to like get rid of a lot of stuff. I had to live a bit of a minimalist lifestyle for a while. So it's taught me a lot of lessons to not become attached to things anymore, and to really appreciate like the basics of health, sunlight, sleep, community, like we were talking about before. Just really drilled home the important things in life, but it's definitely taught a lot of lessons.
Yeah, definitely. And that's true. Again, it's a tricky one, because with mold, you don't want to sound like an extremist or a fear mongerer, but sometimes you do have to be thinking about property. I've had clients when actually they've replaced their mattress, for example, and suddenly they've had a next sort of phase of healing. So sometimes things from that old property that you've brought with you can be an exposure of that mold. So we do have to be quite mindful of that, and appreciate, I guess, as a result, that it's going to be a relatively long journey, and we just need to, as we always say, kind of peel back the layers of the onion one by one until we get to where we want to be.
And I definitely don't want to fearmonger, but I just wish I heard someone talking about mold 5 years ago when I was going through like the worst of the health issues. But it's definitely not something everyone needs to look into. And with the whole mold exposure and like cross-contamination things, I was like really anxious about that. I had mold paranoia. That is a real thing. When I moved into my new place, I left a lot of stuff at my parents' house, so I had that was a good thing that I had them to leave stuff with. But you can sometimes buy like storage or a lockup to keep things in there, so you don't need to purge everything. Some people are like, just burn everything and don't take anything with you, just take the clothes on your back. But I slowly brought things over. I managed to bring pretty much a lot of my stuff with me. I did a particular cleaning method of all of my clothes, because I love my clothes, and it was like very wasteful, I thought, to like throw everything away. So I took the bare minimum with me, cleaned them with things like borax, vinegar. There's a cleaning solution from E3C. It's a company in America. I think that's the name of the product. I think the company is Microbiome something. You'll be able to find it if you type in EC3 or E3C. They have a laundry detergent. It works out really expensive with the shipping and everything. I thought it was a steal, because it was like $20. I was like, oh, that's amazing. So I bought a ton of it, and then I got hit with custom charges in the UK. But I've washed them like 3 times, and it seems to be good. But I was like really paranoid when my parents would come over. I could smell on the clothes the mold. I don't think anyone else can, but just because I'm so sensitive to it now, I can really see that. But I also had to just remind myself there's never going to be a zero mold environment. I'm going to be exposed everywhere. I shouldn't be reactive to like a moldy coat or something like that. That's just a sign that my nervous system and my immune system is still suppressed. And if we go out into the woods, there's mold and mycotoxins. It's a little bit different to the indoor molds, but I really try to tell my clients now and remind myself that the fear of mold is probably just as harmful as the exposure to mold itself. So I'm really into like retraining the brain. There's even courses like DNRS that can be used. I did the course and everything, but I just couldn't keep up with it because I don't have the willpower, because you need to be like motivated to do an hour every single day. And I noticed that I was improving anyway, so I don't really stick with that. But your brain can, when you go through, and that what I went through was a trauma on my body, like physical stress and trauma. So whenever my body smells or senses mold now, it goes into fight and flight mode. And even though I'm like, tell myself it's fine, I'm getting better, I'm healing, I can't control my nervous system and my amygdala and my brain. It just goes into like overdrive right away. So you have to learn how to calm that down. So things like meditation and breath work and brain rewiring can actually be really important, especially for those who aren't seeing great improvements just from moving alone. Sometimes you need to also deal with the brain circuits that have just been wired to be reactive to everything.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. Yeah, and I think that whole kind of brain rewiring element of things for some can be a real game changer. It's the same old thing, you know, it's just depends on the unique individual that we're sitting with, I guess.
It depends on how sick you are too, because there are some people who are like bedbound with chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, they can't move. Because I'm young as well, I'm only 26. My body, and I've been living a healthy lifestyle, eating organic food for years, just while I was still living in the mold. So I got my health to a certain point so that when I did move, my body like could heal a lot quicker. But for some people, it depends on the severity of the mold exposure. If they're living in like a wet, damp, black mold Stachybotrys home, sometimes all of the furniture is contaminated and it's just not going to be worth taking with you. And if they're chronically sick, if I was in that case, I would probably just start from fresh if I had the means to. So it just depends. You read online, like people are very extreme with just like, you have to always, you can't take anything with you. I've not found that to be the case. Like personally, I'm proof that you can still get better with taking some belongings with you.
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, and have said, there are so many variables that will influence that. So we know that the type of the mycotoxin, the amounts that you've been exposed to, the length that you've been exposed to, your overall health, whether there is a genetic predisposition, there's lots that will influence how you need to go through that healing journey ultimately.
It's the same with any like health issue. There's not like one size fits all for IBS or migraines. You have to adapt it to the person.
Brilliant. All right. Any final thoughts or anything that we've missed that you would like to bring in?
I think the patience is really important as well. So going slow with it. I'm 6 months out, but I still feel like my body needs extra time. So I've heard people say at least a year, at least 2 years. For mold, it's really slow and steady, but I'll have to see how my mycotoxin results are. I would just say don't overlook the basics again, because it is really important. It's good when you know all of this stuff like adaptogens and adrenal support and like mitochondrial hacks and biohacking. All of this is great. I really love aspects of that, but it really does come back down to clean air, clean water, clean food, community, sleep, and just getting back to natural living. But yeah, the world is becoming just more toxic as it is. And you can try and do the best that you can inside in your home 90% of the time, but as soon as you go out the front door, you're going to get air pollution and all of that. So not trying to be perfectionist. Also, I'm like type A personality, so I'm like trying to control everything. But it's really taught me that you can't control anything really, and you just have to go with the flow and just take the lessons that you've learned and know that there's a silver lining, because when you're in it, it's really hard to see the positives, but when you come out the other side, you really understand that everything's playing out for the right reason at the exact time it should be.
Yeah, lovely. Well put. Brilliant. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure. People don't know from this podcast that I was on your podcast beforehand, so we've spent the entire morning talking.
I feel like we know each other intimately.
So yeah, I think it would be great to be able to maybe speak to you next year, actually, once you've done sort of the retest and sort of almost do a check-in to see how things are going.
Yeah, would love that. Definitely. I share everything online. I'm an open book, so I want people to see. And I think with practitioners as well, like you do, sharing your experience and your journey we talked about your ayahuasca, not your ayahuasca, your psilocybin and psychedelic journey, because I used to feel bad about sharing my health issues as a practitioner, like, oh, I'm going through this at the moment, I've got the mold illness now. I used to feel like people would be turned away from that, but I actually found when I share what I'm going through, it actually attracts more people to me, and nobody's perfect. Some practitioners seem like they're on a pedestal, like they're this epitome of health, but everyone's going through something, so just remembering that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that journey. I think I'm sure it's going to resonate with people because, as you say, when we are struggling with chronic health issues, mold is one of those things that certainly we just want to be mindful of. So you've given us some great tools to go away and sort of almost investigate our home, consider what our symptoms are and whether they relate to what you've been speaking about today. So I'm looking forward to the feedback, and thank you for sharing it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me and allowing me to share my story.